Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us on this beautiful midweek Wednesday. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Denny Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. And before we move into today's program, we're going to move through it. It might still be a long day. And if you haven't already, we will be collecting questions throughout the day on index cards. If you'd like to ask questions, you should find them around the room, especially at check-in. Folks on my team will be collecting them from the ends of the rows throughout the panel conversations. And each moderator is going to answer as many questions as possible in the last 15 minutes of the conversation. I also want to take a moment to offer some heartfelt thanks. First, to the incredible team at the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. None of our work would be possible without each of you and your creativity, your hustle, and your deep dedication to this community. So thank you for showing up not only this morning, very early, but also every day to make North Brooklyn greener, brighter, cleaner, and more vibrant. So give it up for my staff. Thank you. Carrie Whitkin especially for putting today together. Thank you. Thank you to our partners at 25 Kent. That's the building that we're in now, a gorgeous building on our waterfront. We're grateful for your community partnership and for your commitment to North Brooklyn's future. And I also want to thank Vesper. So Vesper Events is a new venue here on the 4th floor. They are our hosts for today. I am truly honored to welcome you here today as we mark 20 years since the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning. But this isn't just a policy anniversary, right? It's a deeply personal moment, not just for every single person in this room, but also for me, because like so many of you, this is the story of my own journey over the last few decades. It's also the story of this organization that I am very honored and proud to lead. I moved to this neighborhood in 2003, right as the rezoning was being negotiated. And at the time, I was working at the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation on revitalization efforts in Lower Manhattan. At that time, the city was looking to rebuild. We were all still reeling from the aftermath of 9/11. It was a moment of deep uncertainty, but also one of possibility. And at the time, we were asking big questions about how to bring life back to neighborhoods that had been shaken to their core, how to reimagine public space, how to retain residents and businesses, and how to foster resilience in the face of such devastating trauma. Here in Brooklyn, we were facing our own revitalization efforts, industrial lots, polluted waterways, and those wild in-between spaces where you could sense the potential for transformation. North Brooklyn specifically had, and I would argue still has, its own kind of energy. It's a bit more gritty, layered, but unmistakably alive. It felt like a place on the verge of change, with a community determined to shape its own future. There has always been, and I use this word often when talking about North Brooklyn, there's always been a tenacity built into the ecosystem here. You could feel the legacy of the environmental struggle and survival, which was different for each of us, but shared in our spirit. And that's the story of how I got involved in parks. Shortly after the rezoning, I worked with artists here to document those early transitional years through murals, oral histories, sculpture, most of which took place in our parks. Because at the time, for me, art made a space for memory and possibility in places where formal planning maybe hadn't caught up yet. And like so many of you who have fallen in love with this place we call home, I started volunteering. Because you know that that's what you do when you move to North Brooklyn. Eventually, that led me to NBK Parks, of course, OSA at the time, and I learned the organization was created around the time of the rezoning negotiations. Essentially birthed from this vision, this demand that new development must come with new green space. Many years later, I joined as executive director, and that was just before the pandemic, with dreams of expanding our cultural programming in parks. But like everyone else, we had to pivot, because COVID was a reckoning for our team, for our city, for how we think about public space. The lack of adequate parkland, which had already been a challenge, became critical during that time because people were pouring into our parks. So at North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, we stepped up our work to supplement maintenance, stewardship, and advocacy in the community. A few years ago, we celebrated our own 20th anniversary, and it was so close to this milestone we're celebrating today. And it became clear how much has changed the last 2 decades. If we were to rezone today, we would probably ask better questions, maybe about climate resilience or stewardship, maybe about funding or how to integrate community. But today we're trying to answer those questions now. We're going to talk about innovative funding models, collaborative planning, new kinds and rethinking waterfront design, through long-term investment in the public realm, but not just the built environment, but actually the living, breathing, and shared places that hold us together. Personally, as for us all, the work has come full circle. Joe mentioned his children. Well, my children are approaching middle school, and I watch them play at Bushwick Inlet Park after so many years of advocacy and waiting. And those moments feel like a promise finally kept, but also a reminder of how far we still have to go. Because as you all know, the waterfront is still fragmented, it's still contested, and the rezoning plan from 20 years ago is still unfolding. It's a story that's still being written, and I hope this anniversary marks the beginning of its next chapter. So today we're joined by planners, policymakers, advocates, and neighbors, and some who shaped the original rezoning, others who are now shaping its legacy. And I want to thank you all for being here. I look forward to learning together with you. And to help us begin that process and to open today's conversation, I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Councilmember Lincoln Restler. So Lincoln, as we all know, was born and raised here in Brooklyn and has dedicated his life to the communities that make it up, especially here in the 33rd District. He's made climate change one of his top priorities, releasing the first ever climate action plan and roadmap, and championing initiatives like community composting, cooling centers, local flooding prevention through his, if you could check it out, his new Adopt a Catch Basin program. He's also secured major investments in green space, like capital projects in McCarran Park, an American playground, while pushing for safer streets and better air quality across our neighborhoods. And above all else, as far as I can tell, he's laser focused on delivering a completed Bushwick Inlet Park. Efforts we've witnessed with city storage coming down this spring. Go check out the view if you haven't yet. And the inlet opening up this fall. So please join me not only in thanking him for these efforts, but welcoming Councilmember Lincoln Restler.
After 12 years, I can understand why you miss Steve so much. Where is Steve? Is he somewhere here? We should give our former council member a big round of applause. And I really want to thank Joe and the team here at Vesper for hosting us in this extraordinary space. I don't know that you could hope for a better view of the Williamsburg Greenpoint waterfront rezoning area than standing or sitting right here. And I really just want to thank Katie and the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance team. You know, one of the great outcomes of our rezoning was the forging of the Open Space Alliance. And over 20 years, we've had exceptional leaders who created a conservancy for parks across Williamsburg and Greenpoint that advocate and champion and invest and mobilize volunteers to improve our parks in every single corner of our neighborhoods. And I really just want to thank everybody who's contributed to OSA and now North Brooklyn Parks Alliance over the years. Folks like Steve Hindy and Adam. Jane was a longtime board member. I know many others, Dave. I don't think that the organization has ever been doing better than it is today. And so I really just want to thank Katie and her whole team and Carrie for organizing today. Could we give them all a big round of applause? So this week, 20 years. It's hard to believe. It certainly makes me feel old. Does it make anyone else feel old? A little? No? We can't all be ageless wonders like Katie and Ward over here, who I think look exactly like they did 20 years ago. I will say in my now 20 years of wrestling with this rezoning, I don't believe that I've ever felt more positively about it than I do today. And that's not to say that I feel positively about it. For our community, the broken promises of waterfront parks, schools, of critical investments that have still not yet materialized stings very deep and has been gravely disappointing. But for its time, way back in 2005, this 175-block rezoning that generated now 30,000 units of housing across CB1 incorporated an innovative, at the time, inclusionary affordable housing framework that's generated some affordable housing, that formally protected the industrial business zone area here on the north side, that preserved good manufacturing and industrial jobs, created a vision for a waterfront esplanade, and of course promises of 54 acres of new parks and new schools. This rezoning was a marriage of our community pushing to revitalize the waterfront, expand green space, grow a dynamic community. That was reflected, of course, in our 197A plan that our community began working on in the 1990s. And, of course, the Bloomberg administration, which wanted to build a waterfront that could accommodate the 2012 Olympics and expand market rate housing. I cannot speak to the veracity of that tale that I've heard maybe 1,000 times, that George Klein, the waterfront, the Park Tower Group leader who owned much of the Greenpoint waterfront, that he at some point whispered to Mike Bloomberg that he wanted to rezone the area, and that was what did the trick. I can't speak to whether that is true, but I think that the Bloomberg administration and our community were right, that this area, one train station away from Manhattan, was indeed ripe for a major redevelopment. I did recently read Dan Doctoroff's book. Has anyone read it? Autobiography? No? A couple people. Regina has, I'm sure. Am I right? Regina has. I really enjoyed it, and I encourage others to as well. But I had not, I guess, as fully appreciated, looking back, how central the 2012 Olympics was to everything that was happening in New York City at the time. That the Hudson Yards, Long Island City, downtown Brooklyn, Williamsburg Greenpoint rezonings, Coney Island were largely to create the Olympic Village and the space for waterfront sports and to allow for us to be competitive in securing the 2012 games. And it was the overarching vision that so much of the rezonings and the new development was kind of baked into. I was really proud in reading that book that the deputy mayor, so sorry, for those who don't remember, Dan Doctoroff was the deputy mayor for Mayor Bloomberg, who oversaw housing and economic development from 2002 to, I would guess, 2007, maybe 2006, 2007. And he was really the major kind of leader and force within the administration for the rezonings, and he had been, prior to joining the Bloomberg administration, the person leading the Olympic bid in New York City. So that was his big thing. But I was really proud that even Deputy Mayor Doctoroff acknowledged in his book that amid all of the different major rezonings that the Bloomberg administration did, in no place did they encounter more resistance than right here in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And it's our do-it-yourself, our DIY, roll-up-your-sleeves community that pushed back and said, it was working class, Irish and Italian and Puerto Rican and Dominican and Polish residents, artists, loft dwellers, new gentrifiers, the diversity of the Williamsburg and Greenpoint community organized and pushed back and said, we're not just here for market rate housing. We want investments in green space. We want investments in affordable housing. We want to protect and preserve good industrial jobs. These were our priorities that we brought to the fore, that we demanded were included in the final rezoning. And so I really just want to say thank you to all of those great leaders, community board members, neighborhood organizers, just residents of our community who gave a shit, who put time and energy into making this rezoning better, because it is dramatically better as a result of the work you did. Even the inclusionary housing bonus at the time, which I think, and Regina and Howard can correct me, was a 33% density bonus if you could get a 33% density bonus on your building if you did 20% affordable housing, which at the time was like a innovative approach. Of course, it was less than a decade later that we passed mandatory inclusionary housing that required you, whenever you were rezoning a property for residential development, that you had to build between 20 and 30% affordable housing. No questions asked, no zoning bonus, no nothing. That just had to be part of the plan. But at the time, the other rezonings that were happening in New York City didn't have that same commitment to affordable housing. And I also want to say, and I think this is probably the first time I've ever said this, the architects of this rezoning deserve credit too for achieving density and expanding housing supply where it belongs. You know, this is a transit-rich community, and at the time, New York City was beginning to significantly grow again in population, and there was a need for more housing. And our community has really led the way in expanding that housing supply. You know, here in Community Board 1, we've added 40,000 people since the time of the rezoning. That's a 25% increase in our population. That is, you know, we've had more new housing starts in Council District 33, thanks to the work of David Yaskey and Steve Levin and others. We've had more new housing added in our council district than any other council district in the city, and it's not even close. And there are many council districts, I can shout out neighborhoods like Bay Ridge and Canarsie and others, Eastern Bronx, that have done nothing, like literally nothing in that time period. So we have been doing our part to expand housing supply. Doing big rezonings, 175 block rezonings are never easy, but the city was right to push for it. This was an appropriate area to rezone. When we look, though, at what have been the changes over this period of time, you know, we see demographically a lot more young families in our community, which has been wonderful. We see the median household has increased significantly. We went from what was at the time a working class community to now one that is well off. Politically, a community that was moderate at the time that is now, you know, mostly represented by folks who are socialists. The demographics have shifted a lot. We've also seen significant shifts in the Latino population. You know, the Churches United for Fair Housing did a study when they were advocating for racial impact studies being incorporated into rezonings that found we'd lost 15,000 Latino residents in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. 15,000 Latino residents that have, you know, been displaced from our community. And we all know how fast the rents have gone up. My very favorite data point is 77 Commercial Street. Everyone knows where 77 Commercial is. You might be able to see it from here, but it's the northern tip of Greenpoint. You are on Newtown Creek, so you've got to be, I think on a good day, if you're a fast walker, a 15, 17-minute walk to the G train. That's your closest mass transit. Anyone want to guess what a 3-bedroom apartment in 77 Commercial is going for? $9,600 a month for a 17-minute walk to the G train. We have an Hermes on North 6th Street. You know, rents have doubled in our community over the past 20 years. It has not been it has been a very challenging time for working class families in our community. So what's worked from this rezoning? You know, as I mentioned, this area was right for new development. You know, in the rezoning area, we've created 12,500 new units of housing as of, I think that was 2019. So, and thousands more since. So we've got to be well over 15,000 units of housing that have been created to date in this rezoning area. In CB1, we've generated over 28,000 units of housing. I mean, we're talking about a lot of new housing that has been really needed in our city and has been an important contribution that our community has made to the city as a whole to addressing our housing crisis. And I think that the other piece that I would say has really worked was there was a forward-thinking, bold plan for ensuring waterfront access. And development site by development site, the esplanades get built and waterfront access is achieved because it's required. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts around it. And over time, we will have the gorgeous esplanade and the consistent access to our waterfront stretching from the north side of Williamsburg to Newtown Creek. What hasn't worked? You know, the city made huge promises to our community back in 2005. I don't know if you would say they were promises they knew they couldn't keep or promises that were totally unrealistic. But the city really did fail us. They promised us parkland on sites that the city didn't control, right? And as a result, and they promised us a school essentially on top of, right, adjacent to one of the most toxic sites in our neighborhood. And 20 years later, we are fighting tooth and nail every single day to make sure that the promises that were made to our community are finally, eventually realized. As a candidate for office in 2021, following through on the promises, both of the Williamsburg Greenpoint rezoning and the downtown Brooklyn rezoning was one of my central commitments to our community. And I spend more time, as folks like Katie and Catherine and Steve and others can attest, to trying to help move Bushwick Inlet Park and Box Street forward and the school site forward than just about anything else in this neighborhood. So let's just go through where we are on the parkland promises. WNYC Transmitter Park, a beautiful little stamp of a park, did open in 2012. It is, my favorite story from the opening of that park was that it had been completed for months, and we were waiting and waiting and waiting to cut the ribbon and open our very first park from the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning 7 years later, but they couldn't find a date on Mayor Mike's calendar where he could get out here. So I called Rich Calder from the New York Post, and he got on top of the roof of the industrial building on the south side of Greenpoint Ave and took a bunch of photos about a completed park. And 3 days later, without Mayor Mike, the Parks Commissioner, I don't think Mayor Mike made it, although Steve will probably remember, the Parks Commissioner cut the ribbon and we finally opened up our park. And I really want to thank the friends of WNYC Transmitter Park who've done an amazing job stewarding the park. There are more and more people who are invested and involved than ever before. I'll do Box Street next. I had a call on Box Street Park this morning with Mary, who's somewhere and is wonderful, and the EDC to try and finally move this park forward. The Box Street Park is 65 Commercial Street. It's the northern tip of the neighborhood. That's a nearly 3-acre, what's going to be a stunning waterfront park. We received a promise via a handwritten, via a letter from the MTA chair back in, I think, 2006 from Jay Walder that he was turning over this site to our community and we would be able to build our park. And the MTA still hasn't turned over the full site to our community 20 years later. It's extraordinary. We have site control of 85% of the park. They still won't move their emergency response unit, despite Steve pulling out, I think, half of his, pulling out his hair trying to get them to do so. We are moving forward on the 85% of the park that is in our control. Last year, the EPA was doing some testing on the waterfront side on the creek and identified some areas that required further investigation. So we've completed additional remedial investigation last year into the early part of this year, and we're now finalizing just how much additional money we're going to need to properly and fully remediate the park. But we added $8 million in funding about 2 years ago, so we have about $30 million in funding for the park. We're going to need several million more, but we're going full steam ahead. As of this morning, Parks and EDC are committed that we are on timeline to complete the park and open it up by 2028, which still feels like far too long away, but we have a timeline and a plan, and we're going to get it done. That will be a major addition for everybody who lives in the northern part of Greenpoint that just doesn't have access to green space. Other than WNYC Transmitter, there just isn't green space that our community needs. That's good. It is a good thing. Bushwick Inlet Park is less of a good story. This is supposed to be, and you can see it here, right? Stretching from the soccer field all the way up to Motiva at the inlet. Supposed to be a park the size of Fort Greene Park on our waterfront. This is the, as Ward would say, the crown jewel of the park plan in the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning. And there are some good news, some areas of progress. I don't want to be so negative, but we did finally get this damn building down, which was an enormous achievement. And, again, I really want to give credit to our community and to Steve and to others. Basically, what happened, as I remember it, is for the first site that the city was trying to purchase to get control of the first parcel of Bushwick Inlet Park, it went to arbitration, And it ended up costing way more than I think the city had anticipated. So when we wanted to get the largest parcel of the park, or one of the larger parcels of the park, city storage, the owners had the city over a barrel. If you did the same formula that had applied for the parcel that went to arbitration that cost far more than we anticipated, the Brodskys had an opportunity to charge through the roof to get the city to pay. And they did. And I will say at the beginning of the de Blasio administration, I was there and working on this. I think it was a very heavy lift to figure out how we could come up with that much money. But this community would not relent and pushed and pushed and pushed, showed up on the steps of City Hall, pushed everyone in the de Blasio administration. It was one of Steve's top priorities, and we together succeeded. It's $155 million, which makes my head hurt. But 160? Am I giving him? I know Adam was in those negotiations. It was a lot of work from a lot of people in this room and many others. I didn't mean to undersell. Norm got a good deal. But we did purchase that site, and we've purchased every parcel of Bushwick Inlet Park. Since I've come into office, as noted, we celebrated the opening of 50 Kent. We got the demolition done at City Storage, and we are well underway. You can see the progress being made at the Motiva site that's going to open later this year. The Parks Department's ahead of schedule on that one. Those are all good things. What is less good is that we do not have real timelines on the remediation for this large parcel here, the Bayside parcel. And if you look at City Storage South, the city where the building was, and City Storage North beyond 50 Kent, the corporations that polluted those sites are moving far too slowly to clean it up. So you want to know who the bad guys are here? It's Mayor Adams and the City of New York, who have treated this project like just any other capital project with no prioritization, no speed, no care. He came out here when he was borough president and slept in front of this park, and we thought he gave a shit. We were wrong. He doesn't. He's demonstrated it clearly over 3.5 years. It's been a disgrace. Secondly, are the corporations, the fossil fuel companies, who do not care about our community. Now, Chevron has been totally uncooperative. They are one of the 3 major parties here for the Bayside site, and we need to start putting much more aggressive pressure on them. But Chevron doesn't have a presence in our community like National Grid. National Grid, I think, has done a totally unacceptable job in working with our community. The largest fossil fuel site that they own in all of New York State, at least all of New York City, I should say, is right here in Greenpoint on the East Williamsburg side. They have a huge presence in our neighborhood, and they have treated the remediation of this site as if they do not care at all. Every single step of the way, they fight us, they're litigious, they're slow. We've made very clear how important a priority this is for our community, that we want them to work to clean up Bushwick Inlet Park. You tell me that I need to shut up? All right, sorry. I get carried. It's a dangerous thing to give a politician a microphone. Okay, sorry. Now wrap up, please. I got it. All right, I'll close up and just say this. Just a couple of things briefly. The Greenpoint School site is finally moving forward thanks to the cleanup of Newhart, which took decades, but has finally happened, and I think the plan for the school is a reasonable one. We desperately need those school seats, and it's a good thing. What is less good is what happened at Domino, where we'd been promised a new school for our community, but the school construction authority, without telling a soul, without telling me or anybody else in our community, decided that they didn't need or want a school there after all, and forego that opportunity for us. So we lost our opportunity for a school there, which we needed. Other things I'll just say briefly, the city does a totally inadequate job anticipating the needs of a growing community in a rezoning. The de Blasio administration put money aside for schools and parks and resiliency, so over time we've gotten better at that. But no money is put aside for sanitation, for parks maintenance, for the things that you actually know, and to get DOT to change policies on where we need stoplights and where we need stop signs and what is actually required in a growing community is pulling teeth. And it shouldn't be. Right? If we know that the population is going to grow by 25% in this neighborhood, then we should be increasing the sanitation headcount by 25%. We know a large building is going up on a block, and there's going to be 1,000 people living there, we should be putting in the safe street infrastructure to actually make it work for our neighborhoods. And these are areas where we're still really struggling along the north side and the Greenpoint waterfront, and we're pushing the city to do better. One of the solutions that I think will make an enormous difference is something that Katie is spearheading with us, and Ward is co-chair of this steering committee, and that is the creation of a Northside bid. We really think that to improve the street cleanliness, to add to the dynamism of our streets, to improve not just support for our small businesses, but maintenance and support of our open streets and our public spaces, a Northside bid will make a transformational difference. So we are getting close to formalizing a proposal that we're going to bring to property owners and small businesses to get real support and have a ballot in the not distant future to really make this happen. We have 80 bids across the city of New York. They work really well in improving the quality of life in our neighborhoods. The North Side is one of the densest commercial areas where we not only don't have a bid, we don't have a merchant association. We have no infrastructure whatsoever to actually bring together the resources of the private sector and invest in improving the quality of life in our community. We can do better, we deserve to do better, and a bid will make an enormous difference. And I'll just say this. While we have no timeline for the completion of Bushwick Inlet Park, we just have to keep going and keep pushing and keep holding the powers that be accountable until every single promise and the points of agreement is realized. But Bushwick Inlet Park is number one. It is the most important thing that our community needs and deserves. And I can tell you this, for as long as I have the privilege of serving as the council member in the neighborhood, I am going to do everything I can to help mobilize neighbors, partner with all of you to make that park a reality, because our community deserves no less. So with that, thank you so much. Sorry for talking too long.
Thank you, Councilmember Restler. That was a perfect stage setting with the sort of current status of where we are with a number of projects that I know are important to each of you for our first panel of the day. I'm especially excited about this one because it speaks to the long arc of planning and persistence in this neighborhood. Rezoning in Retrospect, Lessons from North Brooklyn's Rezoning. It's a panel that brings together key players from the 2005 rezoning and its aftermath to reflect on what shaped it, from post-9/11 recovery to pre-recession ambitions, and looking back through the lens of our current context that Lincoln so eloquently laid out for us. And our moderator for the first panel is someone who knows that history very deeply, Ward Dennis. Ward is a principal at Higgins, Quaysbarth and Partners, and has been a steadfast advocate for this community for decades, from his work on Community Board 1 during the rezoning to his leadership with Neighbors Against Garbage, now North Brooklyn Neighbors, Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park, and our own board member at North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. So please join me in welcoming Ward and our first panelist to the stage. Please come up.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello? Hey, they work. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists and ask them to kick us off with a very quick question, and that is, what has been the most surprising change, positive or negative, to Williamsburg and Greenpoint that you did not anticipate 20 years ago? And I will start with Regina Meyer. Regina is the president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, and she was director of the Brooklyn office of the Department of City Planning from 1999 to 2006, I believe, which would be exactly when we were doing all the work here. So Regina, can you start us off?
Thank you so much, and it really is a pleasure to be here. The idea that you're moderating this and have been with this for so long, and I'm remembering so many other people, both on the panel and others in the community who we work so hard with. So I'm thrilled that we're able to have this session with so many people in the room. Especially big shout out to Diana Reyna, who I saw, and Steve. Having both of you here is just phenomenal. We worked so hard. There's a lot of surprising change. That was your question, right? And so I'm going to rattle off a few that I think you'll have some resonance. One, when we rezoned the waterfront, there had never been market rate apartment housing built really almost in Brooklyn to the extent that this was. Seeing that both the development community and people wanted to live here was truly a surprise at that magnitude. This was a totally untested process because, and I think Lincoln touched on some of this earlier, all of the land was private, and the community fought so hard through the 197A process to make sure there wasn't waste transfer and there wasn't trans gas on the waterfront, right? So we were really left with thinking about the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal site without, thankfully, without waste transfer and without trans gas and other energy uses. And the idea that this had to be private development was really part of what framed that for us. I'd say the other thing that was a great surprise also, though, is not only the housing, but also the incredible fervor for waterfront open space. One of our colleagues, Dan Campo, heralded how great the waterfront was 25 years ago, but you all fought for this incredible waterfront, and so many of you have seen, and Lincoln has mentioned some of the frustrations in the timing, but there's been huge success there. I give a lot of credit to, and I'd frame the Olympic story a little differently than Lincoln did. It is absolutely true that archery was one of the ideas for the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal market, but our chair, Amanda Burden, cared so much about making sure there was meaningful park space on the waterfront from day one. The thing that is a negative that surprises me is that there's still a city and a state park with a fence. I really hope that you take that on one day and have a full park without a fence. Another aspect that was a great surprise, given how much the community has evolved, is how rich the neighborhood is still with the arts. There is an incredible music scene here. There's an incredible art scene here. There's an incredible culture that I think is one of the most defining aspects of Greenpoint and Williamsburg. And that was a community response to this location. And I really, I can't understate that. Because this is not Long Island City, right? I mean, we're sitting here thinking about that, and the arts has played a huge part in why this is such a great community. And I think, lastly, I would say that we didn't talk about this, but I think we set the stage for other great things, both in terms of housing. Lincoln mentioned that this was a voluntary program. Every developer took advantage of building affordable housing on their sites. I know Howard is going to talk a little bit more about that. And then also Domino. We would not have had a great process at Domino if it wasn't for this rezoning. So those are some of my ideas.
Thanks, Regina. Adam Perlmutter. Adam, you are a New York State Supreme Court Justice, former board chair and founding member of what was then the Open Space Alliance. You worked very tirelessly for the community as our advocate against things like trans gas, and were a major supporter of Where's Our Park through North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. What was your biggest surprise, positive or negative, looking back 20 years?
You know, I think that the biggest surprise is not a surprise at all, frankly.
Well, then that wouldn't be a surprise.
Well, no, but I'll tell you why. I mean, I'm obviously surprised by the amount of density that we're seeing, the amount of traffic that we're seeing. I think that the EIS from 2005 didn't really account for what we're actually seeing happening. So that's a surprise. But what I'm not surprised about, although it shocks me every time I see it, is the massing of the waterfront buildings. And the way, sure, it's the massing of the waterfront buildings. Because when we talk about inclusionary housing on our waterfront, we need to be really honest that in the 2005 rezoning, that was segregated housing. There were segregated housing units and properties, and they were zoned at a lower height than the waterfront properties for the luxury housing. And at the time, the community asked that those sites be combined and that the city do what it could to reduce the massing as high as it is on the waterfront. And that was rejected. And it was rejected not only with that, but the massing that was done has created very generic super blocks along the waterfront that are static, that are really kind of dead zones. And so what I say is that, we kind of saw it coming, but now that we live with it every day, it is a negative that can't be ignored.
Thanks, Adam. And interesting, well, two things. One, I would say one of my positive surprises coming out is how much a lot of the activism from 2003, 4, and 5 wound up influencing what's now standard city policy. So things like having integrated affordable housing as part of MIH, things like having reduced parking requirements in developments, all of those were things that the community was pushing for, that the city was pushing back on, but now are sort of standard policies. And I'd also, Adam, point out that if you look at Greenpoint, it's only about 2/3 built on the waterfront, so there's still more to come.
There's still more density and traffic coming our way, exactly.
All right. Liam Kavanaugh, former first deputy commissioner of New York City Parks during the rezoning period, and I believe you spent more than 20 years, maybe a lot more than that, in the Brooklyn Parks office. What was your biggest surprise looking at the rezoning 20 years later?
Much like Adam says, I don't live in this community and I don't visit as much as I used to when I was working. I'm retired now from the Parks Department for 3 years. But every time I visit, I'm just absolutely startled by this modern, dense community that seems to have sprung up overnight. It's just incredible to see. But a big surprise, and having worked in the Parks Department for 40 years, I worked with a lot of different communities on many different projects, some of them extremely controversial, but I don't think I've ever seen a community that has been so persistent in fighting for what they want in this rezoning. I mean, it's been amazing to see, and you really have some terrific successes, even though there's disappointments and frustrations along the way, and probably more to come. But you've really achieved something remarkable through the rezoning to create this plan for open space. Much of it is coming to fruition right now, and there is a lot to look forward to on the horizon. I guess disappointment or concern that I have is the waterfront Esplanade. The plan is great. The sites that are built are really terrific. They seem to conform well to the waterfront access plan that was developed as part of the rezoning. The supplemental open space, which I didn't quite understand when it was being talked about, seems to work really well, and the sites are really well loved from what I see. And I spent some time here last week just looking at them and seeing how they function. The problem is that they're all disconnected. And for a waterfront Esplanade to really work, it's got to be seamless. It's got to be, throughout the entire length of the waterfront. And I know that's the plan, and it's the fervent hope that it will happen. But unlike the park plan, and again, despite the frustrations and disappointment, there is a plan. There's money in the budget. There's an agency that is really committed to seeing that happen. I don't know if all of those elements exist to make sure that the Esplanade lives up to its full potential.
Thank you. Another community ask in 2005 was that the city build all the Esplanades first. But
I'm sorry that we didn't take that
I'm sorry we didn't too. Howard Seidkin, Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council and former staff member at Brooklyn DCP, Director of Special Projects. Back then, what was your biggest surprise?
It's thank you, Ward, and thanks to Katie and folks for having us here. This is having this conversation with this backdrop is really amazing. It's like looking back on 20 years. I think there's a lot to be surprised by, and some of the surprises aren't that surprising, but it's actually really interesting to see the confirmation of certain things. The first thing I'll say on a lighter, less planning-oriented note is that I think these neighborhoods have become maybe the best food neighborhoods in New York City. Not that they weren't good to begin with, but they're really outstanding, and I think that that's something that that was not part of my plan. But I think it's part of
That-
there were like 75 Thai restaurants at the time, but it's really diversified into a much broader set of. I mean, it's just testament to the depth and complexity of what makes the neighborhood tick. My experience of this was I was like a planner in the Brooklyn office working with Regina on this, and I spent like a couple of years walking around this neighborhood, getting to know everyone, knocking on every door I could knock on to find out what was going on there, and figuring out along with everyone else that what direction this neighborhood needed to change, and figuring out how to get there. And obviously that's a process, and that's not done yet, and we're having that conversation about where to take it from here today. But from there, as Ward said, we wrote a lot of policy based on solving the problems that were facing us. Like, what were the questions that we had to solve here? We had to figure out, how do you allow a lot of new development in a formerly non-residential area? How do you get that to happen? Make sure it's not all luxury housing. How do you make sure that we get the public to the waterfront? We all agreed on the questions, the answers. There's still a lot to work out, but the fact, and since then, we weren't having this conversation back in 2005, but we are very much in a citywide conversation about how the heck do we get ourselves into this housing crisis, and how do we get ourselves out? And part of it is building a lot of housing and building a lot of mixed income housing. And I think that the unacknowledged backdrop here is that, or often unacknowledged, is that this neighborhood has added a lot of housing, a lot of population, but it's actually done more or less what we tried to do and could be improved on, and we can add to it. But every single development on the waterfront has built all the affordable housing that we sought to get built there, and then some. We built a lot of affordable housing policy by experimenting and trying things, and a lot of them actually worked. And people still don't understand exactly how it works, but the big thing was that we said, if we're going to give someone a tax incentive, they better provide affordable housing. And that was really the linchpin to getting affordable housing to happen on the waterfront. And we did. And not only has this neighborhood added a lot of housing, but I was just exploring, the 33rd Council District as a result of the efforts of Steve and Lincoln and a lot of people here, David Yaski, ranks 5th in the city in the amount of affordable housing that's been built in the last decade. And it's really the only, it's alone among other sort of high-cost, high-income neighborhoods in that category. And it really shows that when we try to build more and we put the right tools in place and we stay on it, and it's not a set it and forget it kind of process, we actually can build mixed income communities, and we can actually do some of the things that we were challenging ourselves to do back in 2005.
Thanks, Howard. Steve Levin, current CEO of Solar One and our council member for 12 years. I saved you for last because you had the, honor of inheriting all of this stuff and trying to figure out how to get all of these promises and points of agreements and commitments and everything to actually get done. How is that? And what has surprised you?
So the surprises that I have, they're kind of contradictory. So the first that I can think of is that, how long it's all taken, how long the open space, looking at Bushwick Inlet right now, just how long this has taken. It's 20 years, no park there yet, exactly, right? And how tooth and nail it had to be to get there. So fighting over every last parcel and trying to figure out how to get this all funded, and get those promises that were made to be promises kept. So I think that's a, if I was going back 20 years ago, I'd have been like, oh yeah, they make, you make the commitment, and then and then you'll be fine. It's going to happen. And then on the other hand, the contradictory side of that is that that it's happened at all. Because there's probably plenty of times and a lot of opinions of this is never going to happen. For every naive person like me that was like, oh yeah, it'll the commitments were made and then they'll happen. There were 20 people that were like, those things will never happen. You're an idiot. So
The problem is they were all in the room when the 2005 rezoning passed.
right.
Because I remember somebody told me that they were in the room, and when they agreed on Bushwick Inlet Park, there was kind of a consensus that it's never going to happen. We're going to do this, we're going to promise this, but let's all be honest with each other. In this room, this really ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
And we're going to sell it, but it ain't going to happen. And
So so those are those are those kind of big picture surprises. Yeah, on the one hand, it's been a real pain to get everything, more than I would have thought. But on the other hand, it's happened at all is kind of a surprise.
Thank you, Steve. And for the record, I mean, lots of surprises. I think the absolute most surprising thing to me is North 6th Street, and that we have this luxury retail enclave in the middle of Northside Williamsburg. I did not see that coming. We talked a little bit about this. Regina mentioned some things. Lincoln mentioned the Olympics, but it's 20 years on since the rezoning. The rezoning did not start 20 years ago. It started 30 or more years ago. There was a lot going on in the decade prior. Fights over power plants, fights over waste transfer stations. The Giuliani administration basically wanted to solve the fresh kills problem by sending all the municipal waste through our neighborhood. So let's go back to those 30 years and talk a little bit about what was happening at the neighborhood, borough, and city level that led to the rezoning. And Adam, I guess I will start with you since you were involved in some of those trans gas fights.
Yeah, well, I guess going back 30 years, I was not quite here yet. I moved to the neighborhood in 1997, so I'm just shy of that 30-year mark. But I knew before I moved here that there was a very robust community activism going on surrounding transfer stations. And Neighbors Against Garbage was up and running full bore. I see Felice out in the neighborhood out here, and Peter Gillespie was obviously very integral in that. And I don't see Rolf here, but he was always around their offices and working hard. And then when I moved here, obviously we had first Con Ed wanted to build in the Greenpoint Terminal Market, and that was, they beat a pretty hasty retreat once they got a good look at the neighborhood and what was coming at them. And then Transgas came a year later and said that they weren't going to be chased away the way Con Ed was. And that was a decade of litigation that the rezoning occurred in the middle of. So there really was kind of a...
Not resolved until well after the rezoning.
What's that?
Not resolved until
Not resolved until 5 years after the zoning, finally, when the appeals got put to bed. But, we were, the fact is that a lot of us here have lived in it through a hinge moment in the history of the waterfront, because the change really goes back a lot more than 30 years. It goes back 60, 70 years to the post-World War II decline of the waterfront, of the move towards deep water ports, so that our waterfront was no longer commercially viable for shipping, and then the decline of manufacturing and the retreat of manufacturing to the south, and then ultimately the global offshoring of manufacturing to other parts of the world, which we're now dealing with in our daily lives with the tariff debate. So it's all kind of coming full circle.
Thanks for bringing us up to the moment. Howard, how about we were talking about this the other day, but you had a lot of good insight on this.
In terms of the prehistory, I mean, listen, I could try to give Adam's part of the prehistory. I think you gave my history of the economic shifts underlying the transformation of New York City's waterfront. So I don't have that to say now, but I walked into this neighborhood actually a few years after Adam, and I was this was my job rather than my home neighborhood, but seeing all of the community. The community effort that had been put into saying, that's not what we want, now let's all sit down and figure out what we want. I walked in later in those conversations, the work that went into the 197A planning and community engagement over all of this work was mostly done by the time I got in, so I was the beneficiary of being able to listen to people and what they took out of all those conversations. But I think an interesting part of this, the history, I think, sort of stepping back is that there was a lot going on in New York City as a whole that kind of put this neighborhood uniquely at a sort of opportunity moment and at a crisis moment at the same time. In that not just this decline of waterfront industry and this idea that the waterfront was, fallow and something else needed to happen there, but you had economically the rise of the creative industries in like the Union Square, Flatiron area, along the other side of the L train, people coming out to Williamsburg, exploring as part of that, discovering the neighborhood for themselves. A lot of my contemporaries living in some of the squats and other buildings that were sort of sprinkled around the neighborhood. I remember walking around the neighborhood and sort of creating a map of the 100 or so buildings where we thought that people were living, even though they didn't have formal permission to live. And so all of that stuff is happening as a result of this kind of boiling over. We didn't build housing in the East Village or the Greenwich Village across the other side of the river, so people came looking for it here. And I think that a lot of what sort of created the extraordinary demand for housing was kind of this neighborhood sitting at the crossroads of what it had been and what New York City, what kind of demand was what the broader forces of New York City's economy and housing market were sort of bringing to it.
Cool, thanks. Regina, anything to add on this?
Actually, I think Howard and Adam are totally right on about what they said about what it was like 30 years ago. I think I would add a few other things in terms of community activism as well as where the city was. I know obviously parks and open space are such an important part of the waterfront, but when we started, McCarran Park was simply ignored by the city of New York. The Giuliani administration and other local officials really had almost purposefully not put any money into it. The pool was an abandoned area. It was horrifying. And I think one of the things we knew through the rezoning is that the city had to rebuild McCarran before anything happened on the waterfront. And that is, now as you're fighting for the waterfront, please remember that we were at a place in the 2000s where the city parks department and local electeds had not put attention into McCarran. And it was really important to us then, and I'm so proud that that was the first actions that Diana and Steve fought for. And Adrienne spoke, I think if you remember, at the hearings to this on rebuilding McCarran Park. So I think I feel like it's important to mention that because it was a huge effort to get that sort of page turned for this community. And I'm really proud that that was part of this effort. I think the other few things that I would say about looking back 30 years ago is that the L train and the G train barely functioned. The G train.
Oh, yeah, that.
No, the G train I used to take from Hoyt Skimmerhorn near our office. It was at about a 20 to 25 minute headway. And I'm not exaggerating. It was really not functioning. So although transit is a problem now, it was phenomenally worse then. In terms of land use change, and we are all aware of that, we were well aware of the decline in manufacturing, and Adam is totally correct. NAFTA totally turned the page very, very quickly on that change in terms of manufacturing in this neighborhood. And then it was literally building by building, we were seeing the community start to regenerate this neighborhood illegally or just, by happenstance. And when we started to see that block by block, we realized that the community knew something that we needed to learn, which was this was a great place to be. And I think that we sort of forget that, but that's what was happening. And our origin story, although Lincoln referenced Dan Doctorow's book, and the Olympics, the other side of the origin story for us at the planning department was we were starting to catalog that block by block, and we didn't have GIS then, right? we were doing this on maps, Sanborn maps, literally, is that when we had the incredible moment to present that to the early part of the Bloomberg administration, there was no question for them that we should move forward with starting to plan and rezone. And that lined up with the Olympic effort, but it was separate. And that was an incredible effort on the behalf of the staff of the department to recognize that.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned McCarran. That was, that was a prior administration's, I guess it wasn't a promise, but it was a prior administration's problem that the Bloomberg administration took on. Similarly, Transmitter Park, I think, had been promised under Giuliani, was built by Bloomberg, but promises have been a big issue here and talked about a lot already. Public-private partnerships are really private and then waiting for the public stuff to happen. So, we are seeing, Liam mentioned the Esplanades, we're seeing the Esplanades being built piece by piece as projects are built on the waterfront. Obviously, in hindsight, the city made some costly miscalculations in the acquisition of Bushwick Inlet Park, but that aside, the reality is that the community benefits and mitigation do tend to lag behind private development. But I'm curious what has changed since 2005 in terms of city policy to address this issue in future rezonings. And Steve, I'll start with you.
I mean, I can tell you that every subsequent rezoning, my guiding principle has been get those resources up front, get those public resources up front. So, I would often cite Williamsburg Greenpoint as an example of just like kind of you don't want to do it that way. You want to reverse. And I understand the city kind of probably seeing it as something of a risk to put those public resources up front because you're not sure that the private dollars are going to follow, and then that would be like a sunk cost. But the reality is that this is a pretty engaged community, and people keep good records here. And so, they remember what commitments were made 20 years ago.
And grudges.
Yeah, sorry?
And grudges.
Right, exactly. I wouldn't want to take for granted that that's always going to be the case. That every community is going to have that kind of longevity, or that every community is going to have the people that were interested 20 years ago still putting up the good fight. And so, I think, and I did see a shift during the de Blasio years, that I think local communities got a little wiser about that, and I think the administration was responsive to that. Just one thing I just want to give a kind of credit where credit's due. To David Yaski and Diana Reyna, who were the council members during the rezoning and deserve kind of the credit for taking on these tough decisions. This is a massive rezoning. So politically, this was not like a sure thing for them to do this. And then to Bill de Blasio, because Bill de Blasio is the one, at least on the Bushwick Inlet, he's the one that came up with the 155 of the 160 million.
As well as capital funding.
As well as capital, right. I mean,
for parts of the park.
The last thing he did, right, was like December 27th. It was a freezing cold day on like
the 30th.
The 30th. It was crazy. It was freezing, right? And like he went out and stood on that mound and made the commitment for the capital to build out. I forget which part of it was going to.
He stood with a check for $75 million.
Yeah.
And said, "I thought I finished paying for this,"
right, yeah,
and then handed the check.
And that was
the day before he left off.
That was for taking down city storage and then some of the capital for that site.
Right.
Yeah.
So, he deserves a lot of credit. He got zero political benefit for that. Think about that. He was out of office 48 hours later. There's no political benefit for that. But it was kind of this principle. I think he took it seriously, this idea of, a commitment was made and he has a responsibility to see it through. And so, And so I think that's just, I think what sticks in my mind, or what matters to me, is that future administrations need to take that seriously. It's not a given that like a next mayor is going to be like, yeah, I'll take that seriously. I mean, I think that we hope for that, we expect that of the people that we put into responsibility and power, but it's not a given that will happen. So
Yeah, I mean, clearly, no administration, single administration, can do a rezoning and then actually implement it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at 20 years and we're nowhere near fully built out. So future administrations need to pick up for the past. Would be nice if this administration did more of that. Liam, no, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Which
What, from the Parks Department point of view, were there policy changes in terms of fulfilling promises that happened after Williamsburg Greenpoint?
the Parks Department doesn't get to make those promises. The Parks Department gets to
Fulfill them.
deliver them when and if the administration supports it. But Steve made a good point. In the one of the big rezonings of the de Blasio administration in East New York, in fact, there were residents of this community that showed up at those community hearings and told the residents in East New York,
Shout out to Catherine, Steve, and
make
Scott.
sure that you get what you want, up front. And in fact, there was money put in the budget to renovate and expand parks as part of that, and that money is actually being spent. Some of it completed, some of it in progress. So there was, at least in the de Blasio administration, there was a fairly significant change and a commitment to delivering on some of the promises that were made in that rezoning. But that does underscore the fact that it is dependent on the administration, and part of what I think has bedeviled progress here is that we've had two administrations since Bloomberg when the rezoning occurred, and perhaps a third coming in January, and not every administration feels the same responsibility to communities that the original proponents of the rezoning did.
But I would like to say that you're right, Steve. Diana and David worked so hard with, I think we called it follow-up council action.
Corrective action.
Yes.
Corrective actions, yeah.
And that really was a blueprint for zonings moving forward. And I think a really good example right now is the work that Crystal Hudson is doing on Atlantic Avenue, as a for instance. But that was a very arduous process at the council that Diana and David led, and the community was at the table, and that was a very important part of the process. Should have it happened earlier? I think those are things that the city really has learned more. And honestly, I think the city planning department is a lot more engaged and has structurally changed the way it moves through the process because of that. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I'll just tack on briefly, I think, if I'm not preempting Adam too much. This was the first instance where the city had really undertaken a plan of this size without something that created sort of an independent revenue stream that would fund a lot of the change. Like, for instance, Hudson Yards, which happened at the same time, had a sort of financial mechanism in order to fund the enormous capital improvements that were part of that plan, the extension of the 7 line and all that. This didn't lend itself to a model like that outside of the waterfront improvements, which are funded, at least if not fully coordinated, and there's more to add to that. But the connection between capital planning and land use planning is like this project really teed that up, and there have been certain policy responses, like what the de Blasio administration did when it looked at neighborhoods like East New York, is it actually tried to, set aside a budget allocation that was going to meet at least some of the capital needs that were associated with the planned growth of a neighborhood. The hardest part of that is the timelines for capital planning and land use planning are, as you noted to lead this segment off, completely different. And a commitment from the city government is a commitment from an organization the people behind that are going to be different by the time you're doing it. And so, you know, there had been some efforts to, you know, memorialize commitments in a more concrete way, but you know, a commitment tracker is transparency, but it's still just, you know, electronic paper until there's buy-in from the decision makers and, you know, sort of community-driven political pressure to move those actions forward, because every dollar the city spends on capital stuff is appropriated, you know, on a more or less annual basis, and you have to stay part of that process. So there's an institutional and political dimension of the long-term implementation that I think is really important. I think that organizations like this one, our host today, are part of that we need to find in any neighborhood, the right institutional shape that can, you know, host and shepherd that kind of ongoing drive to implement things when it's, you know, the original, you know, people like me aren't there anymore, whoever was there at the creation are, you know, it's really the community that's there for the longest time. And there needs to be a vehicle for institutions and government to respond to that on an ongoing basis, because the capital timeline in the best of circumstances is so much longer.
And by the way, another thing to come out of the rezoning was stuff like commitment trackers and Tish James legislation. So, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna talk about that. I think that the only thing that we've really seen are these trackers and an attempt to create more transparency. But I mean, let's be honest about you know, policy changes. There really, as far as policy changes, there really haven't been policy changes. You know, there aren't binding community benefit agreements 20 years later that you can bring into court and sue on. You know, I actually, you know, of all the questions that were put together for this event, this is the one that I took most issue with, because of the notion that, well, public money always tends to follow the private investment, you know, the public commitment. And the fact is, it always happens. It always happens. The city always plans, develops, and then puts in the resources. And the fact is, it's never up front. And the only reason that you know, the only thing we're left with is not just moral suasion. It's not that de Blasio kind of said, well, you know, we made a commitment, and boy, oh boy, you know, the city's got to live up to its commitments. That's not what happened. What happened is, and the reason why the East New York was changed, is that our neighbors went to different neighborhoods in the city and said, as the city's considering rezoning and pushing you through ULURP, which, by the way, is really designed to cut communities out of the development process in the city, is my opinion. But, you know, the fact is that the only reason why the city moved off the dime was because they saw their land use initiatives freezing up. They saw problems in all sorts of communities. I see Winston shaking his head. I don't know if he's agreeing with me or disagreeing with me, but the fact is that this community went to different neighborhoods and taught them that, you know, ULURP is filled with unfulfilled promises, and that you need to make sure it's handled up front. But that's not a policy change.
But Adam, I'd say the one
Microphone.
The change from voluntary to mandatory.
That's a legislative change.
But that's a policy
And
change.
that's been
is
an
a policy
important change that builds on an error, as far as I'm concerned, with how our waterfront was put together. Because the inclusionary housing on our waterfront, again, is not inclusionary. It's segregated housing. It's separate buildings. It's not like Domino, where people can't distinguish between a market rate unit and an affordable unit. And I don't necessarily think that that's good planning for our waterfront.
There you go. And that almost takes up most of my next question, which was going to be about housing. And what has changed policy-wise since Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning. Before we go on, if anybody has questions for the panel, please get, I think it's one of these cards, and hand them in. This is the last call. Yeah, so, I mean, Lincoln mentioned it, others have mentioned it. Community Board 1 leads New York City in housing production since 2005. Howard, I think you said we're number 5 in terms of production of affordable housing.
District 33, I didn't have
Okay.
the community district breakdown, so got to be candid about the data there. I'll get back to your word.
I mean, one, I think you touched on it a little bit, but the backstory to how inclusionary housing came about in the first place. And Regina, I think we were talking about this last week. I think that's a really interesting story to hear. And then I would like to continue the conversation that Adam started about.
Sure, and it's super important to remember that before Greenpoint Williamsburg, there was no inclusionary housing of this scale, and there was a huge policy shift that the leadership at the housing agency, HPD, needed to make. Previous to Greenpoint Williamsburg, there was this idea that there could be inclusionary housing only applied to those projects that received no public funding or financing. It was this concept called double dipping that HPD was uncomfortable with because there was so much need at that time to put public funds into repairing the existing housing stock. So when Geraldine Perrine started working on this, this was really sort of a point of tension, and it wasn't until Sean Donovan and Rafael Sestero moved into the leadership roles at HPD that they became comfortable with the idea that projects that required tax incentives could also have affordable, inclusionary housing. And I think one thing that sort of rounds out Adam's analysis of this is that one of the huge untested portions of putting these processes together was how the development community would actually finance and build these projects. And so that is among the other reasons that there are separate buildings, is based in the financing at the time. And then the other aspect of this, which is more of a land use basis, was there was a lot of conversation amongst community members and elected officials about where the density was going in on the very large waterfront sites, and there became a consensus that there should be a lower rise portion on Kent Avenue and West Street, instead of putting towers right on those streets. So there were a few other pieces of the puzzle that were happening as housing policy was evolving, and I think for us, again, the fact that each developer provided the housing was the risk that the city was taking at the time. Now, of course, as we've mentioned, that has evolved into a really much stronger mandatory program that has hardened some of the ways that the incentives work together with the bonuses. But that was really the very beginning of it.
But the city stepping up and changing to mandatory inclusionary allowed for, mandated then that integration. So it was a problem that could be solved. It was,
Right.
I'm going to actually tell a different version of this story. This is one that's a little. It's the same story, but there's, I think, a different tone to it. And this is the path that I followed for the last 20 years. As I did this project, and then I kept on working on inclusionary zoning and affordable housing policy, and now I run this policy organization. And one of the, I think, most misunderstood aspects of this rezoning, as well as housing policy generally, is that zoning doesn't get affordable housing built. It allows it to be built. It allows housing to be built. But the thing that gets the affordable housing to be built is money being put into those projects. Not private money, which has to go into them as well, but there is subsidy of one sort or another, and there are a couple different sorts. One is the city has capital dollars that it spends. There's tax credit, capital, there's other sorts of pots of money that are available to fund affordable housing. And you can spend it on this project here, you can spend it on that project there, but if you spend it on this project, you can't spend those same dollars on that project. And that created that was the root of what Regina was alluding to, is this initial reluctance to allow people to use subsidies and inclusionary zoning because it was going to steer the subsidies for low-income communities into other communities just because you created a zoning incentive that sort of sucks all the money into those. There's another way to subsidize projects, which is through the tax incentives, such as the old 421A, the new 485X. These are not a pot of money that if you spend it here, you can't spend it there. They're basically, it's foregone future tax revenues, and they're not finite. And the difference there is that you can put that together with the zoning incentive and get more affordable housing built overall. And it does mean that the city gets less tax revenue for a period of time, but it's not the same sort of what I call hungry hippos, which is like grab more of the pot of money for this neighborhood and somebody else doesn't get it. The real key to what happened here was not the zoning. The zoning was good. The zoning was our effort to say, when this neighborhood gets new housing, it's got to be mixed income housing. We have to put mechanisms in place that are going to get it there. But the real key was linking it to the tax incentive programs. Before this rezoning, you could build housing in this neighborhood, get a 15-year tax exemption, maybe 25 depending on where you were, without providing any affordable housing. And the first thing that was done was that there was an agreement to change that on the waterfront and say, if you want to get the tax exemption, you got to do what the zoning says. You got to provide the 20% or whatever affordable housing. And you won't get your tax incentive otherwise. And that is what made every development participate in the program.
You're leaving out the bonus.
The bonus is great, but
the
bonus
incentive was, you do this, and we're going to let you build 30% higher.
But the bonus doesn't pay for it because that 33%, most of it is your affordable housing. You're not getting that much more. Like, trust me, Adam, I did the numbers on this. Like, it's good and it's important and it's an incentive, but the two things together. You know, the demonstrations, we also gave a 33% bonus in other parts of the neighborhood, and when they were outside of that tax policy provision, when you could get an as-of-right tax benefit, people didn't use the zoning bonus. It was the two together that made the difference.
Just one thing you reminded me, Howard, is that using the tax tax incentive at Williamsburg Greenpoint in 2005 informed when the 421A. I worked on the 421A revision in 2007-8, and that was the basis for the 2007-8 one that expanded the exclusion area, so the area where you had to build the affordable housing to get the tax incentive, and then that was then the basis for like the current policy. And so in a way, the 2005 rezoning was this kind of birthplace of how this policy then you could follow it into its current iteration now, basically, I think.
That's right, but that's what pays for the affordable housing. And the zoning and that work together, and whether it's mandatory or whether it's voluntary, if you have a mandatory affordable housing program without something to pay for it, it's not going to build your affordable housing.
And there used to be an era with Mitchell-Lama where the government actually built affordable housing in America. We don't do that anymore, though, right?
Sure we do. We still do. It's different, looks different from Mitchell-Lama, but the city spends billions of dollars in its capital program every year to build affordable housing. But if you build a unit here, you can't build that same unit. You can't spend those same dollars in another neighborhood. Can we spend more money on that? That's a great idea. Hopefully we can continue to get resources to do all this. That's really, really important.
One other thing, and because if Dave Lombino's still here, that when we were doing the Two Trees rezoning in 2014, the city had a hard and fast rule that they were not going to put any direct subsidy into affordable housing at Domino. They were like 100%, no, this community doesn't need it, this community can subsidize it. That, because it was the hungry hippo, where it was like it was taking it away from another community, and so that was a flat no.
But they had to use it had to work with 421A at the time in order to make that project work.
Sorry, now I got a whole bunch of questions. Adam, did you have any last thought on
No, I'm a Rock'em Sock'em Robot fan. As opposed to Hungry Hippo.
So last question before we get, and we only have about 2 minutes. So we're going to hear a lot more, I think, about climate change and resilience coming up. But from our perspective, having, Sandy, resilience was not on the radar 20 years ago when we were doing this rezoning. And now it is, we live in a neighborhood that is, that was underwater 200 years ago, will be underwater anytime in the future. So, what from your perspective, what are we doing to make these waterfront developments? What can we do to make these waterfront developments more resilient?
Well, I'll start. I'm not sure that I can answer that question with a satisfactory, we've got this kind of answer, so much as like maybe trace some of the history of how the city has responded to that. And I'm looking at that we have some of the people who have done some of these policy changes for the city over the years. After Hurricane Sandy, we sort of kicked into action about, when I was still with city planning, the city kicked into action in terms of ratcheting up standards for new or substantially improved buildings so that they would be more resilient to flooding, and that they'd be designed, everything here was designed everything here that was built before 1987 was designed before there were any flood maps or flood standards. Everything from 87 to 2012 was designed under an old set of standards. So there's a lot of residual risk in the neighborhood, and there's only so much you can do to retrofit an existing building without, sort of abandoning the bottom part of the building, which is difficult and costly. And so it's a lot easier with new buildings than it is with older buildings. New buildings since 2013 have been allowed to build higher to sort of, to elevate above the flood zone. So the newer the building is, the better it should be able to survive a significant storm event. Older buildings are still going to have challenges, we have to sort of support individual property owners in being able to make improvements on their buildings and support the cost of flood insurance, and those are big challenges. Then there is the sort of, what can you do to help the neighborhood overall? I think, in many neighborhoods, still one of the big challenges is storm drainage and not coastal flooding. Coastal flooding is a risk, but it's not the one that people encounter the most frequently.
And that drainage is one of the biggest issues here. I mean, one of the biggest sources of flooding in Greenpoint in particular.
And so there are the ways that you can maximize the capacity of what the sewer system can do, what the sewer system is designed to do. There are, very, very costly upgrades to, increase the capacity of the system. And then there is the sort of capture that you can do in open space and in rooftops. And new buildings are required to, in this neighborhood in a combined sewer area, large buildings are required to manage all their stormwater on site based on a certain storm. So again, incrementally we're getting better, but there's still a lot of existing building residual risk that has to be maintained. So it's really about opportunism. I look out the window and see, opportunities for storm capture.
Well, yeah, a two-thirds unbuilt park is a big opportunity for doing resilient stuff.
And it will be so much better than the pavement that's right there right now.
The master plan for Bushwick Inlet Park was 2006, 7, I think. So that master plan also predates really any awareness of resiliency, and Bushwick Inlet Park itself and the inlet is a great opportunity for creating a more resilient neighborhood. So I'm going to segue to some of the questions from the audience here, and I guess staying on Bushwick Inlet Park. Would Bushwick Inlet Park have been developed regardless of the political promises without the extremely strong community support? Is that same community strength needed today? No and yes. But any other?
I would say yes and yes to that question. Adam pointed out, there is no legal requirement for the city to fulfill the commitments that were made during the rezoning that don't pertain specifically to rezoned properties. That's just a fact, and you do depend.
We mapped the park.
We mapped the park.
But if you didn't fund it, it doesn't get.
If you didn't fund it, if you didn't acquire it, if you didn't go through all the litigation that surrounded both the acquisition and the prior development plans for the park, there wouldn't be a park. And so
It's no way to run a city, though.
it's not a way to run the city.
I'm just kind of surprised that it's kind of put out there that, hey, we rezoned it, we remapped it, we did our work, and then
It requires the community to really let's have it in her to get what's promised to it. It's just, and again, I think that it points to the notion that Bueller and city planning developers and we haven't even touched on the effects of
campaign finance on all of this, but it's all wrapped together.
And one anecdote that I don't know if I've ever said this publicly. So at one point, this was 10 years ago, the De Blasio administration did float the idea of why don't we put a building on the front side, on the Kent Avenue side of city storage.
It'll just be a small.
Yeah, and I think I called Catherine, maybe Dewey, and I said, "What do you guys think of that?" And they said no. And I went back and I said, "Community says no, can't do it."
And
that was sufficient.
Yeah, it was
Well,
don't
it
pass
took-
go, don't collect $200.
But that was because
I think Catherine did a little more than just say no. But
Well, that's because they knew, that this was a non-negotiable issue, and it was affecting other parts of their land use agenda.
yeah,
And
As they were doing East New York.
as they were doing East New York, as they were doing mandatory inclusionary, and as they were doing the zoning quality amendments as well, which were citywide amendments.
sorry, Adam. I mean, we've been talking about city commitments. You mentioned briefly, but the points of agreement that was hammered out, 20 years ago last Friday, is even less enforceable. Yeah, absolutely. Right? I mean, it's literally a piece of paper.
Well, I think that one thing I want to add is that I think I certainly did not have the answer to this, but I think we all understood that this was a long-term, the acquisition and mapping of a park was something that the city had not done in recent memory, right? This was a lift and everyone understood that. And there was a plan and it was not foolproof and it was certainly not condemnation process proof. And it's required a lot more work by a lot more people to get it done than I think any of us would have hoped for. But I have an anecdote about Bushwick Inlet Park that I'll share, which is that, in the early stages of this process, we were beginning the Euler process, and we needed to file the applications for the land use actions to map the park. It was just called the park. It didn't have a name. We had to give it a name, and we didn't want to, we knew that there was a lot more work to do to sort of flesh out what this place was going to be. But what we did, and what I remember, I had to do this. It was the last thing I did before I filed the application, was come up with a name for the park. And my thought was, let's call it Bushwick Inlet Park, because I knew that was going to be the hardest thing, was to get to the northern edge of the park. The park was going to be easier to start acquisition at the southern edge, and the northern part where the transgas plant was proposed, still very active at the time, was going to be a long-term process, not just through with compromises and other things suggested on the way, that maybe it would be okay if we didn't finish the park. And we knew that we had to finish the park and it was going to be a lift. So that's the only reason it has that name. The natural feature at the northern end of the park we had to get to. And it's really, really heartening to see the first pieces of that starting to exist out there. Obviously, would that it have been sooner, but it's a testament to all the efforts of everybody who've pulled together to make that happen.
Thanks for that naming. So we have a few questions on housing, and I'm going to try to summarize a couple of them. But a couple talking about what's the pathway forward to create affordable housing, not just based on AMI, but truly affordable, so that Latino families displaced can return. And in the same vein, somebody else asking, sorry, I lost it. The neighborhood is an example of nationwide rapid gentrification and displacement of Puerto Rican and working class residents. And then on the flip side, or maybe not on the flip side, but affordable housing initiatives are great, but what about market rate housing? We fundamentally need so much more housing. What's preventing that from happening? So a lot packed into those three questions. And
I'll start with other people can chime in too, but I'll start with the sort of, it's not unique to this neighborhood, but it's pronounced in this neighborhood that there's a depth of need for affordable housing and for deeply affordable housing that is very, very difficult to satisfy, because getting housing to be affordable at very low and extremely low incomes requires often not just capital subsidy, but operating subsidy in order to sort of keep the building operating in the black. So that is a big challenge, particularly where there are not pieces of city-owned land that we can put city subsidy in. We rely on programs like the tax incentive programs that get us to incomes that are low, but not necessarily extremely low. There are rental assistance vouchers, which are extremely at risk right now from the federal government, Section 8 program, which allows us to get people at extremely low incomes into low-income apartments. And that's a critical resource that needs to be maintained and augmented. But overall, I think neighborhoods where the land is as costly as this are going to be reliant on tax incentives. I want to highlight one thing about a couple of the questions there about the Latino population of the neighborhood. And this is something that we at City Planning, when I was in City Planning, and since then have dug into. And it's a much broader sort of issue, and it's broader than the rezoning area, certainly. But there has been in Community District 1 a declining Latino population since 1990, and declined very sharply from 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2010. But really, interestingly, since 2010, it has increased pretty significantly. It has not increased
in CB1, it's decreased.
Sorry, in the rezoning area, I should say.
Okay.
So there's like an analysis.
It's decreased much more slowly 2010 to 2020, but still has decreased.
Yeah, I can look back at the exact figures that I tried to shoot over to you, but one of the things that's happened by adding a lot of housing and adding a lot of people, every racial and ethnic group has increased in size in absolute numbers. That's not that they have not all increased in the same proportion, and the socioeconomic distribution of that is something that's not really easy to unpack with the data. But I should have answered this as the big surprise. I don't think I would have predicted that the rezoning of this area would reverse the decline in the Latino population that had been going on for 20 years. It seems to have contributed to it by creating a lot of housing opportunities and a lot of affordable housing opportunities.
Well, I think we're seeing increases and numbers happening within the rezoning area, but a large part of the Latino population lived outside the rezoning area, and yes, a lot of the decrease was happening already in 2000, 2010, but gentrification and displacement have certainly happened.
Yeah.
And there has been a sizable loss in Latino population, and it's gone from about 40% down to 20%.
In the broader community. And I want to be clear.
That is not just loss in Latinos, that's also increase in non-Latino population.
So I'm going to highlight two things, and then I'll let Adam talk. I'm sorry. The one thing is that this is not a mission accomplished statement. This is a what can be accomplished by doing something statement. And it is, I think, an underappreciated attribute of the rezoning that the black population of the rezoning area has more than doubled in the last, more than double between 2010 and 2020. Like there's some it is a small population, but a growing population. The Asian population has increased dramatically. The white population has increased a lot in absolute terms, but not proportionally within the rezoning area. So there's a lot of diversity in the results of this. This rezoning does not solve all the housing problems of the city or the neighborhood. There's a lot more that needs to be done on top of that, but it's just an illustration of what is possible when you relieve scarcity and you make sure that a big chunk of it is going to be affordable to people at lower incomes.
Steve.
There's one thing that I think is important to note about that makes this rezoning not replicable in the future is this court decision around community preference. So this rezoning had a 50% community preference for the affordable units, and I think that's capped now at like 15%, 20%. And that's a big difference. So that means that 50% of the affordable units in this rezoned area today, because this is exempted from the decision, are set aside for CB1 residents. Because of that, I know 3 or 4 families that have gotten affordable units in newly built units as part of the rezoning. And that's an impossibility, just by the numbers. I mean, like, there's no, the pool of CB1 residents that are going for 50% of the affordable units is probably, I don't know, like a 10th or a 20th of the size of the citywide pool. Or, I mean, realistically, a 50, how many community boards are there?
51.
So anyway, 2%. And so that's something that can't happen again. And that has made a huge difference for this community. Yeah. It definitely does not in any way alleviate or ameliorate affordability problems citywide, but it does have an impact. This community preference has an impact on the affordability crisis in this community.
Yeah. And ironically, that lawsuit generated from a different rezoning in CB1.
So did the judge get it right or wrong? I don't know.
I don't think it was the other.
No,
it wasn't from a CB1 rezoning.
It wasn't from
not.
Broadway
It was
Triangle?
not.
I thought it was. I thought they,
What? Oh.
Broadway Triangle, they sued
it was a
over.
Bronx rezoning.
This was 2 plaintiffs. It's a different case, but not unrelated. I think the same challenge has been made multiple times.
Yeah.
And it creates there's some real implications about when you start the conversation about what you're trying to do for a neighborhood and for the people who live there then, and your ability to deliver that. Like, I think there's no longer that latitude.
So last question, and a very quick one because I think we're just at our time. Going back to promises and parkland, knowing that the rezoning was going to quickly incentivize land use, does that suggest that the promises that the city made were done in bad faith?
No.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, you look out the window. I mean, yes, it's slow, and yes, there's lots of, as I said, disappointments and frustrations, but there's a plan, there's money in the budget, there's an agency that wants to make this happen very badly, and that will make it happen given support by succeeding administrations.
Steve?
I don't know. I mean, it has, if there wasn't an active and engaged community that kept good records, like, I don't know if all of those would have come to pass. I don't know if it was, I think that it was a bit of a roll of the dice. I think in knowing now what we could have known or should have known then, or may have known then, that's why you get the upfront commitments. And so I think that I think that the process has improved. To Adam's point, it's none of this is, we still don't have the legally binding mechanisms where you can go in and sue on it. And so, but I think at a certain point you work with the tools you have, and I think that it is a testament to this community's fortitude and ability to hold the powers that be accountable, why these things, are happening, however gradually.
And I think it's also important, particularly with Bushwick Inlet Park Promise, to remember that the judicial decision that inflated the costs of all of those properties could not have been known. Yes, the city. I mean,
there was no judicial decision inflating the cost of those properties.
No, it was
What happened
negotiated.
was that. Well, let's just be clear. What happened is that there was a parcel that was directly next to where the soccer field is, and when it went to arbitration, the question was, what is a likely scenario for the development of this property? That was the issue that was in front of the arbitration. And what was decided was that since that property, and since the committee apparently had stalled out and not followed through on their promises on Bushwick Inlet Park, that property was seen as a property that could be residentially developed because it would be adjacent to existing open space. That drove up the price in arbitration.
Right.
There was never a decision.
That's true.
There was
That's
never
true.
a judicial decision. And frankly, but there was a judicial decision, which Howard, which was the one who was really responsible for bringing to the attention of the community, which was that there were decisions in Hudson, over in Hudson Yards, as well as in downtown Brooklyn, by two judges that said the value of properties that are taken after a comprehensive land use plan, like Greenpoint Williamsburg, is the zoning that exists at the time that the plan was implemented, which meant that these properties, the city was correct. These properties were properly left as industrial land.
But the city,
But in retrospect, they should have bought them first.
And they should
They should have bought them.
And they should have moved in
them
immediately and bought
the city
them.
wasn't willing to take the risk
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Right. And they should have
on going
immediately
through
come in and
eminent
take the
domain.
risk.
And on that, Katie's giving me a stare. Thank you to all of our panelists.